and I hope I can add somehow my contribution to the general discussion. Because of the self-referential nature of my inquiry, I really need to read my paper. And indeed, I'm going to talk about theater and language, and I'm going to do it by performing an act of language. So in order to avoid, this endless self-referential prism and blowing my mind, I need to read. There is no PowerPoint presentation because I want us to address a very strange topic, which is the invisible component of verbal language. And so if you have the PowerPoint, you cannot see the invisible component. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so since Aristotle, Western tradition has usually regarded theater as mimesis, namely a reflection and representation of reality. It is possible to argue, however, that theater is not simply a form of art. If the aesthetic notion of theater takes the spectator's perspective, in the post-war era, alternative philosophies of theater have been elaborated by notable figures of experimental theater such as Peter Brook, Judith Malina, and Julian Beck of the Living Theater, Jerzy Grotowski, Eugenio Barba, and Carmelo Bene, to name a few. The common trait these visions share is the rejection of the conception of theater as a product, namely an object, in favor of a philosophy of performance where acting is regarded as an experience of self-exploration and self-discovery. So this is a subjective perspective. Most importantly, I propose to consider theater, or better performativity, as the constitutive originary dimension of knowledge. More specifically, performativity appears to be the condition of possibility of knowledge. The focus on the inner process that performing acts trigger also leads to overcome the Cartesian mind-body dualism, which seems to be a mere intellectual abstraction. And in this regard, I would like to call to mind the presentation delivered by Professor Efrati yesterday, because if my understanding is correct, we can say that mind can cause a damage to the body, that is, in this case, the brain, and the body, once healed by biology, can in turn make lost memories to reemerge, reactivating the proper functioning of the mind. So mind and body are co-constitutive, theoretically speaking, and interconnected in the real practice. So the mind-body dichotomy indeed misses, I argue, to grasp the undefinable human ability to generate creative acts. Creative acts from which any form of knowledge, any discipline of knowledge spring from. From here, a new notion of performativity can be elicited, a notion, however, which strongly differs from the postmodern one, because the postmodern one is typically relativistic, and it rejects any absolute by claiming that knowledge depends on the specific cultural context. But this position is problematic because if everything is relative to the context, what about this very sentence? Is it relative? No, it is absolute. So this is a self-refuting position. So there is a problem here. So I'm looking for, a root. Otherwise, we cannot find any foundation. So rather, my notion of performativity, which I draw on British philosopher of language Austin and his notion of performative utterance, my notion of performativity evokes the subject's unconceivable, unsayable, infinite cognitive experience of an all-embracing dimension. So there is a hiatus, a difference between the act which produces a given theory and the definite objectified result of this theory. So in other words, a theory cannot encompass itself within its horizon, because the process which made this theory possible cannot be included into the theory, because the theory is the result of it. So for example, if you think about a mathematician elaborating her formulas, okay, at the end of the process, hopefully the mathematician can find the solution to the problem. But the solution to the problem will be expressed through a demonstration. And this is a linear expression of knowledge. So you just have the correct steps connecting the starting point and the solution. But this is not, but there are steps missing, because what about all of the mistakes that the mathematician did? What about all the passages that are not included into the demonstration? Because retrospectively, the theoretician understands that steps weren't necessary. It means, again, that we have a difference here. So performativity, so intended, allows the subject to acknowledge this unsignifiable dimension through which knowledge, system of science, symbols and concepts, it doesn't matter, can be built, expressed, and understood. In other words, not theory, I already said that, is capable of encompassing, which means objectifying itself, because it cannot explain through its own assertions and rules the performative, the formative process from which it has derived. And this is the paradox of self-reference, and of course there is also mathematics involved in this, because there are the two theorems of incompleteness by Gödel, but this is not something we really need to focus on right now. So I will try to provide an example of how performativity works by taking into consideration an absurdist self-reflective play. This play allows to observe the contradictory nature of nihilism. Nihilism is a philosophical doctrine according to which we comes from nothing, we are destined to nothing. So basically, it's not like relativism where there are many truths. It's like truth exists, but it coincides with nothingness. So it's a little bit different. And in order to start this very brief analysis of this play by Luigi Pirandello, an Italian playwright, the winner of the recipient of the Nobel Prize in 1934, and the name of the play is Six Characters in Search of an Author. Maybe you heard about it. I wanted to explain very quickly what is a performative contradiction. So a contradiction, a logical contradiction, is like my red cat is white, so you probably suggest me to get some rest because I'm not very sane in saying this, because of course the problem is within the sentence. Okay, the content of the sentence is contradictory. Performative contradiction is different, because an example of performative contradiction is I'm not speaking. So there is nothing wrong in the sentence itself, because if I say you're not speaking, it's perfectly okay. So the problem is not about the sentence itself, it's about the incompatibility, the contradiction between the content of the sentence and the status, the assertive status of the sentence, or in this case, the very fact that I'm performing the act that in the content is denied, okay? So the performative contradiction kind of helps us understand this double dimension of language, the invisible part and the material one, or the vocal one in the oral speech. So what about this play by Pirandello? Okay, a little bit of contextualization first of all. So we have the crisis of positivism, the influence of psychoanalytical theories, the revolutionary discovery and advancement in physics and mathematics, Freud, Einstein, Heisenberg, Gödel, and all of these phenomena shaped 20th century Western thought, undermining the assumption that scientific method would be the only source of factual knowledge and that reasoning would be able to exhaustively understand human nature and the phenomena of reality via empirical experimentation and mathematical deduction. Consequently, the quest for a refoundation of epistemology arose in many fields, bringing into the limelight a problematic self-reflexive tendency in both the science and the arts. And now we can understand the theater of the absurd. Pirandello is like the pioneer of the theater of the absurd. It's interesting that this play by Pirandello was composed in 1921, first version 1925, the second one, and we have an historical coincidence between Pirandello and Moreno, and perhaps during the second part of my presentation you will see that there is a connection between the two. So, accordingly to this crisis, the theater of the absurd reflected and staged the crisis of Western thought and its progressively nihilist descent. So the theater of the absurd reflects a vision, a representation of the world where meaning, rules, and roles have just vanished. To support my thesis, I will briefly examine this play by Pirandello. Here's the plot very quickly. So you have a theater troupe which is ready for a rehearsal of a Pirandello's comedy entitled Mixing It Up. And so you see, the first trace of self-reference here. But this is not important, it's just a joke. Suddenly, 6 figures enter from the rear of the theater. In addressing the manager, these 6 characters, claim to be 6 characters in search of another. As the manager says that he has no time for these, absurdities, by the way, the leading character, the father, replies that life is full of absurdity, that they do not need to appear plausible to be true. And after this comment, the father explains that they are in trouble because the author decided not to complete their story. So this is a weird play because the point is not the development of the story. The problem is an existential discomfort that these weird characters feel. And these characters are self-aware. They know that they are characters, which is another important aspect to stress. Because this is like the metaphor of human beings, of course. It is more complicated than this because since their story is incomplete, they want to, they demand the company to actually materialize on the stage the incomplete story of these characters. So the manager takes interest and eventually accepts the unusual proposal. However, during the rehearsal, the characters lament that the actors are not qualified to interpret characters' drama. After all, actors merely play roles. Instead, characters are roles. The 6 characters are consistent, coherent, and non-mortal, while actors, the humans, are inconsistent, contradictory, and mortal. For this reason, with the chiasmic inversion, the characters claim to be more real than the actors, which is obviously a paradox. However, the characters experience existential discomfort. Their self-awareness, their awareness of being identities, naked mask, as Pirandello would say, this self-awareness makes them feel imprisoned into a fixity, which suffocates them. So as a consequence, the desire to be different from what they are, metaphorically speaking, so they desire to be different from what they are, which is not something that the character is supposed to feel, right? Because the character is part of the story and he has no problems about the story. He has problems belonging to the story because he has no self-consciousness. Metaphorically speaking, they represent the human discomfort or disappointment of realizing the inability of techno-scientific knowledge to make full sense of subjectivity. Subsequently, the play ends with an inevitable failure because the manager and the actors leave and the 6 characters disappear. Because of this anti-mimetic strategy, something happened because a feeling of desperate emptiness pervades the scene, okay? Because there is this nonsense that it kind of invades reality, because suddenly theater is no longer the locus where the simulation of a just fictitious reality takes place. Rather, it ends up exposing reality itself and its epistemological foundation as a form of simulation, as a deceptive illusion which is doomed to collapse. So we have the inconsistency of identity and this assertion that the nature of reality is illusory. And this is typical not just of this Pirandello's play, but of all of the absurdist dramas throughout the 20th century. So in philosophical terms, this is the position of Nietzsche. And I quote, "Every belief, every act of taking something to be true is necessarily false because there is no word of truth at all." The will of power. "Reality is nothingness covered," end of quote. "Reality is nothingness covered by false temporary truth destined to dissolve. What remains is one single evidence, the meaninglessness of life." Meaninglessness is a contradictory word because it's like giving meaning to the absence of meaning. So maybe we can think about this. This is a performative contradiction. However, I contend that Pirandello's play triggers a decisive counterintuitive implication, and here the performative power of theater is gonna show itself. Because now we can understand the contradictory essence of nihilism. Why? Because the very negation of reality as such, and its identification with its opposite, namely illusion, so reality coincides with illusion, proves to be a self-refuting statement. On the real stage, because this is the story, but we have to imagine that now these 6 characters are interpreted by real actors on the stage, obviously, and this changes totally the situation and the interpretation of the play. So here we have the power of theater that can help us escape from this, kind of mental, intellectual, psychological self-deception. And I'm gonna tell you why. Because once the dramatic text is performed, the characters are obviously interpreted by real actors. And when you have one of these 6 characters denounces the actors, the fictional ones and the real one now, okay? Because now, okay, in the text we have the characters and the actors, but they are all characters. When the dramatic text is performed, we have only actors. So the situation totally reversed. And what happened? In the very moment in which the actors say, or this actor, okay, interpreting the father, the leader of the group, when this actor says, "I'm an actor," the so-called suspension of this belief, which is the attitude that you have when you enjoy a work of art, so you pretend that you believe something that is clearly false because it is fictitious, of course. But if an actor on a stage is going to say that he is an actor or she is an actor, at that point, how can you believe it? So it's like, the simulation of this fictitious world just stops necessarily. And so what emerges at this point? The fictional representation, the Pirandello play, disappears. And so the play, performatively, on the stage, restores precisely what it was meant to abolish, namely the consistency of reality as the opposite of illusion, because what remains in front of the spectators is the real act of performing, the real actors, which shows this real act of performing. It shows itself to be the conditional possibility of any play, including those which stage the denial of reality and such. So what is behind this idea is this act of performing it. And this is not true only on theater, this is just the materialization of what language is. Because in this case, we have the invisible part present and visible, thanks to theater. So the play indirectly provide us with an insightful evidence. Through the play, theater reveals its performative power, by the way. It makes manifest the double articulation of language as a logically determined content, the said, as Emmanuel Levinas, the philosopher, used to say, and the ongoing event of thought that has produced it, the said, the content. And this is what Emmanuel Levinas called the saying, so the act of saying something. Theatrical performance exposes such double level of expression, escaping at the same time from the logical impasse that it triggers. Because if you just think about it, you cannot escape from it, because you can never have an external point of view to objectify it. So you are a victim of this mechanism. But thanks to theater, you can create this meta dimension through which you are simultaneously the actor and the observer. On the one hand, such realization illuminates the threshold of thought, the liminal awareness of the inherent limitations of logical thinking, which cannot prove its own coherence. But on the other hand, it leads the subject to experience a radical infinitude, which silently accompanies her creative performing acts of knowledge. It has argued that the nihilist stance misinterprets such an emerged impossibility for human understanding to objectify itself. Nihilism proved to be self-refuting because it consists in the unawarely contradictory attempt to objectify the very limit of knowledge, which is obviously an unachievable goal. Because if you understood that you cannot objectify your creative act, and if you start defining your condition, you are fooling yourself. Because you experience the impossibility and now you want to reduce, you want to objectify, you want to annihilate it within a definition, but you experience through your body, your mind, body, that this is impossible, okay? And now I try very humbly to enter your territory, so I'm going to do it very slowly, and I'm going to load and lower the tone of my voice. The theater of the absurd and the cognitive realization it conveys may be useful, maybe, a useful tool for therapeutic purposes, drama-based therapy. If the subject cannot manage any longer the unbalanced relationship with the other's subjectivity, which always exceeds any definition that we can, imprison a person in, this subject identifies as the cause of such an existential discomfort some part of his own person, okay? So you want to dominate it, you want to perhaps objectify it, or even annihilate it. So this is my attempt, maybe the body for the anorexics, the conscious mind for the drug addicts, the partner's body and mind for sex offenders. For instance, it was just examples. Moreover, absurd displays vividly convey and embody existential angst and psychological claustrophobia. Therefore, by simulating absurd pièces, French, patients might experience emotionally and then cognitively, thanks to therapists in mediation, the constructiveness of social roles and identities. If one comes to realize the performative dynamics permeating every meaningful definition of both herself and the others, she can distance herself from her own biased or not assumptions. They are just assumptions. So it's like to say my subjectivity and other subjectivity do not coincide with fixed identities, never, because I'm not the role that I have simulated to be. So if I simulate something that's so close to my, existential discomfort or condition, well, the very fact that I was able to perform it, to simulate it, create a space thanks to which maybe I can start distance myself from it. But it depends obviously on the medical conditions. This is not my territory, just an idea. Maybe you will let me understand if it's totally wrong or not. In this sense, absurdly placed may provide a source to foster self-awareness process. So, and here I have in mind the theater of the oppressed. So, because of the resemblance of fictional characters' discomfort and patients' existential suffering, staging these scenes might provide them with a tool to objectify some of their own inner conflict, which can finally be observed from an external point of view. So I argue that one's subjectivity does not consist never in any identity. It does not consist neither in a given superimposed identity, obviously, but nor in the possibility of intentionally constructing a new identity, as Judith Butler claims, for example. Because I really think that in both cases, identity becomes an objectivation of the self and the other self. Indeed, in conclusion, I advance the subjectivity individuates itself in the performatively achieved awareness of being immersed in an originary dimension which reveals itself to be the common ground of every subjectivity, that is, of every human being. Thank you.